It happened overnight. One day, the marble pillars and shimmering glass of American banks promised prosperity and security. The next, they stood cold, dark, and deserted. Lines snaked around city blocks filled with panicked faces staring at locked bank doors, their life savings, their dreams, held hostage by an enemy they couldn't fight, a silent collapse of the system they were told to trust. The news, a relentless torrent of anxiety, showed the human cost of this financial earthquake. Families who had diligently saved, who had played by the rules, were suddenly thrust into economic freefall. Jobs vanished overnight, the security of a paycheck replaced by the dread of unpaid bills and empty cupboards. The very backbone of the American dream, a good job, a home, a future for your children, seemed to crumble before their eyes. The whispers started quietly, then grew into a roar. How could this happen? Who was to blame? The answers, like the faces of those responsible, remained shrouded in the shadows of corporate boardrooms and the halls of government. But one thing was clear: the American people, once again, were left holding the bag, their futures sacrificed at the altar of greed and reckless ambition. The panic wasn't confined to the lines outside shuttered banks. In gated communities and sprawling estates, a different kind of fear took hold. The wealthy, accustomed to their world of privilege and insulation, watched their carefully constructed fortunes dwindle. The stock market, once a playground for their wealth accumulation, became a casino where fortunes were lost as quickly as they were made. The collapse exposed the fragility of their gilded cage. Those who had profited most from the system now scrambled to salvage what they could, their desperation echoing through hushed phone calls and frantic backroom deals. But the walls were closing in, the illusion of control shattered by a force larger than their carefully curated lives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very people who had preached the gospel of free markets and individual responsibility, who had lobbied for deregulation and tax cuts that benefited the few at the expense of the many, were now reaping the whirlwind of their own making. The system they had rigged to serve their interests had finally buckled under the weight of its own corruption. The scenes of despair and disillusionment broadcast on screens across the globe felt eerily familiar. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, echoing the fall of empires past. The Book of Revelation, with its chilling prophecy of Babylon's demise, offered a stark and unsettling parallel. Just as Babylon was a city consumed by its own excesses, so too had America become a nation blinded by its pursuit of wealth and power. The unquenchable thirst for more, the relentless pursuit of profit above all else, had eroded the very foundations of society. The American dream, once a beacon of hope and opportunity, had morphed into a gilded cage of its own, trapping its citizens in a cycle of debt and despair. The parallels were undeniable: the rampant materialism, the moral decay, the widening gap between the haves and have-nots. America, once a shining city on a hill, now found itself teetering on the precipice, mirroring the sins of a fallen empire. The collapse of American banks wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a spiritual reckoning. It laid bare the consequences of a society that had lost its way, a nation that had traded its soul for the fleeting promises of wealth and power. But in the ashes of this fallen empire, a glimmer of hope emerged. The crisis, in its own devastating way, offered a chance for renewal, a wake-up call to reclaim the values that had made America great: honesty, integrity, compassion, and a commitment to the common good. It was a time to reject the false idols of greed and materialism and embrace a higher purpose. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but the path was clear. It was time to rebuild, not just the economy but the very soul of the nation. It was time for a spiritual awakening, a return to the principles of justice, equality, and opportunity for all. The American dream, though tarnished, could be salvaged, but only through a collective act of will, a commitment to forge a more just and equitable society from the ashes of the old.